This video proposes that there is a key cognitive process that both psychedelics and schizophrenia share, the amplification of pattern recognition, particularly in the form of pareidolia, the perception of familiar patterns in random stimuli, such as faces in inanimate objects, and ideas of reference, seeing personal significance in otherwise unrelated events. Psychotomimetic agents might be the appropriate term to describe psychedelics, inducing transient states similar to schizophrenic experiences, by activating the brain's pattern detection systems. Both the profound creative insights and the delusions experienced in these states might be explained by this increased sensitivity to patterns. Understanding this parallel could offer therapeutic insights into schizophrenia and develop new cognitive tools for navigating cognitive patternicity in psychedelic experiences. Before diving into my findings, I want to briefly share a segment from Michael Shermer's TED Talk, The Patterns Behind Self-Deception. This clip will help provide essential context for understanding the concepts of pattern recognition and noise filtering, which are central to this discussion.
Dopamine, I think, changes our signal-to-noise ratio. That is, how accurate we are in finding patterns. If it's too low, you're more likely to make too many type 2 errors. You miss the real patterns. You don't want to be too skeptical. If you're too skeptical, you miss the really interesting good ideas. Just right, you're creative, and yet you don't fall for too much baloney. Too high, and maybe you see patterns everywhere. Every time somebody looks at you, you think people are staring at you, you think people are talking about you, and if you go too far on that, that's just simply labeled as madness. It's a distinction perhaps we might make between two Nobel laureates, Richard Feynman and John Nash. One sees maybe just the right number of patterns to win a Nobel Prize, the other one also, but maybe too many patterns, and we then call that schizophrenia.
Shermer's idea of dopamine regulating signal-to-noise ratio provides a fitting analogy for what might be happening in both psychosis and psychedelic states. When the signal-to-noise ratio becomes too high, as he explains, you may start seeing too many patterns. This aligns with the hypothesis of pattern amplification in both psychedelics and schizophrenia, where an overactivated pattern detection system can lead to cognitive pareidolia and heightened ideas of reference. In this section, I will outline the specific attributes that make schizophrenia, mania, and psychedelic states appear closely related, particularly focusing on the shared phenomenon such as pareidolia and heightened pattern recognition. To begin, I'd like to introduce a YouTuber named NedNedNerb the Schizophrenic. His channel focuses on raising awareness about schizophrenia by educating viewers on the unique symptoms associated with the condition. In one of his videos, he provides a detailed account of his experiences with pareidolia, a symptom he regularly encounters.
Most often, the way I've heard neurodiverse people put it is seeing faces in everything. This has been an ongoing feature of my visual experience since late high school, when I was showing more and more signs of psychotic disorder. Obviously, to me, there's something about pareidolia that indicates a high capacity for psychedelic art, creating, participating, or observing. But also it is kind of very distracting. Sometimes when I look down at the ground, or the side of the alley, or look up into the trees or at the clouds, I see strange, sweet, and monstrous faces looking back at me. The fact that this is kind of a brain-related symptom is indicated by my experience of pareidolia varying widely from day to day and month to month, depending on stress and activity. It is not just more stress equals more pareidolia. That's not it. There's something tidal and seasonal about it, like it is strong for a time, then weaker, which I've noticed happen in my hypnagogic imagery before sleep, too. This month, this year, I've been seeing faces around. It's somewhat like a low-level psilocybin effect, but the rest of my experience feels basically normal. It trips me out.
Another example comes from a private email I received from a man with a psychology degree who also shares his experience seeing faces and objects when his symptoms worsen. Quote, "Hey man, my name is, and I've been following your channel for a while now. I have a degree in psychology from York, and I'm also diagnosed with schizophrenia. I also see faces and objects when my symptoms get really bad. Although I am on medication and my illness is stable enough where I can hold a job, and I'm currently pursuing a master's degree. If you want to chat sometime, I live in. You can reach me at. Just text me and we can set up a time to talk. I hope I'm not making you feel uncomfortable by reaching out. Hope to talk soon. According to a PubMed study published in 2020, individuals with schizophrenia exhibit aberrant face tuning, meaning they are more likely to perceive faces where none exist, such as shadows, food, or objects. The study interprets face pareidolia as a deficit in perceptual integration and social cognition. However, the contrasting idea I propose is that this phenomenon might not necessarily reflect a deficit. Instead, it could be an amplification of pattern detection, where the brain is in overdrive, identifying connections between stimuli at a much higher rate. The issue might not lie in impaired cognitive function, but in an overabundance of pattern recognition that requires better filtering. I'd like to share an example of how certain visual experiences on psychedelics seem to share similar patterns and motifs, highlighting pareidolia and recurring archetypes. Artists like Acid Flow, Luke Brown, and Blue Lunar Night have captured this shared visual architecture in their work. What stands out to me is how my pattern recognition on psychedelics seem to overlap with these styles, almost like a watermark over my vision. I first noticed something similar when I was 16, during deep mushroom trips. Back then, I haven't encountered these artists, yet I have depicted similar forms, collages of archetypes, grinning faces, and clowns that closely mirror their work. Here are the works by the artists, which echo the same psychedelic visuals I experienced. Many of these artists explicitly aim to recreate their psychedelic experiences. The fact that I can say we share a strikingly similar style is worth noting. Luke Brown's work frequently features pareidolia, as seen in earlier pieces like this one, which suggests a level 5 psychedelic experience or ego death, and more recent pieces, such as his 2020 work titled Pareidolia. This pareidolia effect also became prominent in another way during my psilocybin trips. I vividly remember how my hand became anthropomorphized, through pareidolia, into a spider-like entity, moving as if it had a will of its own. With similarities between psychedelic states and schizophrenic experiences established, I'd like to highlight a study from PubMed published in 2010. This study revealed elevated urine levels of an endogenous psychedelic tryptamine called bufotenin, NN-dimethyl-5-hydroxytryptamine, in patients with schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorder. This suggests a potential biochemical link between these altered states of perception and cognitive function. It's important for me to share my personal story because, while anecdotal, it provides valuable data points for this discussion. I've had experiences with mania and psychosis in 2013, 2015, and 2021. And these episodes tie into the connection between heightened pattern recognition and altered states of consciousness. In 2013, I experienced my first bout of mania/psychosis, triggered after consecutive days of heavy psychedelic use. At this time, I was using a combination of 5-APB, a psychedelic stimulant similar to AMT, cannabis, and smoking DMT. During this period, my open-eye DMT trips began changing. I experienced intense pareidolia, seeing facial features in everyday objects, such as buttons or electronic equipment. The strange part was that DMT didn't just reveal faces, but animated them. Objects came to life and appeared to move, and other objects tessellated as if they were transformed into 3D models. This drawing illustrates what was happening in my trip just moments before my episode began. You can already see signs of my relational thinking going into overdrive while I was on a breakthrough DMT dose. I was using a tube-style electronic vaporizer and wearing a hooded blue sweater. As soon as I opened my eyes after the trip, my pattern recognition immediately latched onto the idea that I was cosplaying the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland. his blue body and tube hookah. This association never came to mind before, but it surfaced instantly in that heightened state. I'd like to quickly touch on my psychosis episode in 2021 now, which further illustrates this point. That episode, triggered by cannabis, led me to perform a ritual that involved very pure DPT, N,N-dipropyltryptamine, at doses ranging from 30 to 40 milligrams insufflated over 5 to 7 consecutive days. Following this, I experienced severe pareidolia that persisted for months, even as I abstained from all substances. During the early stages of this episode, I was compelled to take pictures of the pareidolia that seemed to leap out at me. Before I show you these images, this clip from Michael Shermer's TED Talk provides essential context.
And so I think that we evolved. There was a natural selection for the propensity for our belief engines, our pattern-seeking brain processes to always find meaningful patterns and infuse them with these sort of predatory or intentional agencies that I'll come back to. So, for example, what do you see here? It's a horse head, that's right. It looks like a horse, must be a horse. That's a pattern. And is it really a horse, or is it more like a frog? See, our pattern detection device, which appears to be located in the anterior cingulate cortex, it's our little sort of detection device there, can be easily fooled, and this is the problem. For example, what do you see here? Yes, of course, it's a cow. Once I prime the brain, it's called cognitive priming. Once I prime the brain to see it, it pops back out again, even without the pattern that I've imposed on it. And what do you see here? Some people see a Dalmatian dog. Yes, there it is. And there's the prime. So when I go back, without the prime, your brain already has the model, so you can see it again. What do you see here? Planet Saturn. Yes, that's good. How about here? Just shout out anything you see. That's a good audience, Chris, because there's nothing in this. Well, allegedly, there's nothing. This is an experiment done by Jennifer Whitson at UT Austin on corporate environments and whether uncertain feelings of uncertainty and out of control makes people see illusory patterns. That is, almost everybody sees the planet Saturn. People that are put in a condition of feeling out of control are more likely to see something in this, which is allegedly patternless. In other words, the propensity to feel these or find these patterns goes up when there's a lack of control.
Now, applying the concept of cognitive priming to the images I captured, I hope to give you a clearer sense of what I'm seeing. My mania symptoms include strong pareidolia, ideas of reference, which means believing Facebook posts are secretly referring to me, or assigning personal meaning to synchronicities, or thinking strangers secretly recognize me. And then there's delusions of grandeur, so believing I'm a prophet, messiah, famous, god, or alien. Intensified and vibrant colors, pressure in my temples, and racing thoughts, specifically accelerated relational thinking, where concepts and analogies between subjects begin to rapidly cross. The symptoms I find most intriguing is the heightened sensitivity to relational associations. In both 2013 and 2021, my mind was in overdrive, constantly focusing on and drawing parallels between all the knowledge I have accumulated, as if my brain was automatically pulling from any piece of information, finding patterns, and connecting them to basic structures I was dwelling on. During this time, I began constructing a sort of manifesto, a compilation of all the patterns I was seeing, patterns that felt as if they were automatically jumping out at me. The core structure of my thought process during these episodes was based on dimensionality, starting with a single point, expanding into a line, and then into higher dimensions. From there, my mind started automatically connecting and drawing parallels between seemingly unrelated concepts that followed the same dimensional structure. For example, I found connections between the way mycelium begins from a single spore, a point, and then branches out into a vast network, a line, surface, and then ultimately a 3D structure, to colonize the substrate and produce fruit bodies. How a digital discrete signal can approximate an analog continuous signal if you increase the sampling rate high enough, allowing the discrete points, lines, to merge and form smooth representations. How a 3D model can be tessellated, where individual vertices, points, multiply and connect until they create a continuous, smooth surface, again moving from the discrete to the continuous. These patterns emerged rapidly as my brain latched onto the foundational idea of dimensionality and began finding relational connections across disciplines, from biology to digital signal processing to 3D modeling. What seems to be happening here mirrors the mechanisms of pareidolia. In the same way that pareidolia draws out patterns in visual data, these intellectual connections were automatically emerging in my thoughts. Through this cognitive overdrive, I experienced both incoherent associations, false positives, as well as creative and novel ones. In many ways, this heightened intellectual pattern recognition functions like an aimbot for ideas and connections. Just as an aimbot in a game like Counter-Strike helps a player automatically lock on to a target with increased accuracy and speed, the cognitive state during mania or psychedelic experiences seems to automatically zero in on patterns and relationships between ideas. The brain, in this mode, efficiently identifies parallels and associations across a vast array of concepts, almost like it's running on an enhanced mental performance mode. However, just as with an aimbot, which occasionally can lock on to irrelevant or unintended targets, there's a risk of picking up on false positives, seeing connections that aren't truly there. The challenge, then, is maintaining a kind of cognitive filter to ensure you are hitting valid targets, real patterns, rather than just firing at random, illusory, or irrelevant connections. The idea I want to emphasize is that if you have a rich mental database, this overdriven state can facilitate integration by allowing deeper, more fluid connections between pieces of knowledge. This could lead to innovative insights and more advanced thinking. In my own case, it's difficult to say whether my experiences of psychosis and mania were caused by DMT or merely triggered by it. In conversation with professionals, I've heard that DMT and other psychedelics frequently lead to mental health episodes for some people. One notable instance was when a coworker at Value Village in 2020 asked me about my DMT experiences and warned me that his friend developed quote-unquote bad schizophrenia after using a lot of DMT. Even though these are just anecdotes, they're data points worth considering. After my episode in 2021, I stopped using all cannabis and psychedelics for 2 years, but eventually found that this approach wasn't working for me. Now, I use cannabis daily, around a gram of high-potency extracts called honey oil, and use psychedelics sparingly, at medium to high doses. However, I've noticed that the frequency of my cannabis use has made the pareidolia I experience more prominent again. Cannabis didn't give me pareidolia and other symptoms before my first episode, but now it does. If I had to speculate on the reason, it perhaps could be that psychedelics, especially at frequent high doses, causes neuroplastic changes in the brain, which might have heightened my sensitivity to pattern recognition and pareidolia in the long term, and now cannabis seems to exacerbate these effects when it didn't appear to before. During my psychosis in 2013 and in 2015, most of my time was spent posting on shroomery.org, so my account serves as a detailed archive for my cognitive state to be examined. While editing the sound for this video using Adobe Audition, a useful analogy struck me regarding the concept I want to introduce. In audio engineering, when you increase the volume of an audio signal that's of poor quality, the amplification will inevitably raise the level of unwanted noise, like a hissing sound that becomes more prominent as the signal grows louder. Fortunately, there's a tool called noise reduction, which allows you to isolate that unwanted noise, capturing its noise print, and subtracting it from the overall signal, resulting in a cleaner, clearer sound. I believe the same process could be applied to cognition, particularly in states of heightened pattern recognition, like during psychosis, mania, or other altered states of consciousness. Just like noise can obscure the clarity of audio, the overwhelming flood of patterns we detect in heightened mental states can obscure coherent thinking. The mind begins to amplify irrelevant patterns, associations, or ideas, leading to cognitive distortions. However, if we could develop a cognitive filter akin to noise reduction in audio, we could potentially filter out the mental noise, like irrelevant or misleading patterns, and retain only the useful, coherent insights. The idea here is to train the mind to recognize false positives and filter out cognitive distortions, such as ideas of reference or delusional connections, while focusing on the valuable patterns that provide genuine insight. This theory suggests that cognitive behavior in states like schizophrenia, psychosis, and mania may not necessarily reflect a deficit or disorder, but instead stem from the temporary impairment in cognitive control systems, which leads to faulty filtration of amplified patterns. By developing cognitive tools to assist with filtering, individuals might manage these experiences in a healthier way, preventing delusional thinking while maintaining access to their creativity and insight. What I think we need is a framework to interpret and integrate patterns in heightened states of pattern detection, similar to the techniques used in cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT is effective because it helps individuals recognize and reframe distorted thinking, teaching them how to differentiate between harmful thought patterns and constructive ones. The same principle can be applied here. We could develop a cognitive toolkit to help individuals navigate the flood of patterns and connections that arise during psychosis, schizophrenia, or even psychedelic experiences, allowing them to retain meaningful insights without becoming overwhelmed by delusions. In exploring how heightened pattern recognition might drive delusions, it's important to understand the issue of poor integration. Often, individuals might project these amplified patterns onto symbols in their everyday lives, attaching undue significance to them. For example, someone who has just watched The Matrix might begin to believe they are the One, reinforcing the narrative with symbols and synchronicities they encounter in their environment. They might see their birthday as cosmically significant, or interpret a birthmark as a divine sign, patterns that reinforce their delusional worldview. The real problem arises when these associations are taken literally rather than metaphorically. The human mind is wired to find patterns, but in heightened states, these patterns become overwhelming, and our natural inclination to make connection goes into overdrive. The mistake is confusing the map for the territory, seeing the association as concrete truths rather than abstract, poetic, or symbolic representations of reality. This is where the cognitive framework comes in. By teaching individuals to view heightened associations as metaphors or poetry, they can better integrate their experiences without falling into delusional thinking. Framing these connections in a more abstract, symbolic light can help people manage their insights more productively, without succumbing to grandiose beliefs or paranoia. During heightened states, it's easy to feel both liberated and isolated. It can seem as though you've tapped into a deep, universal truth, which may lead to delusions of grandeur, the belief that you are superior to others and even divinely chosen. It's the kind of thinking that is seductive because it feels empowering, but it ultimately serves to isolate you from the rest of the world, as the ego grows more dominant. I learned a lot from a YouTube video called Why You Think You Are Jesus, which discusses this exact phenomenon. Here's a direct quote from the video that resonated with me.
Once the ego comes back online, some people are quite frightened and terrified of what just happened to them. Others feel even more alienated in this world and have a deep desire to go back to the other side. And then others are simply unable to let go of the experience, having what's normally called delusions of grandeur. Here, people don't remember their experience symbolically as the awakening to their own Christ consciousness. No, with delusions of grandeur, people see their experience concretely, that they are the Christ and superior to all others. However, it's my belief that, again, with loving support and a little guidance, people with these delusions can gradually understand that the true power of the awakening of their Christ consciousness comes when you're able to recognize the Christ consciousness in others and truly connect with other people in a more open and loving way.
What I love about this perspective is that it doesn't seek to invalidate the significance of someone's experience. Instead, it shifts the understanding of their revelation into a more socially constructive and grounded way. It reframes the experience from a solipsistic, isolated belief into one of connection and shared awakening. Encouraging this kind of integration helps avoid outright invalidation, which can lead to resistance and further isolation. One effective cognitive tool that I developed for managing fear-based delusions is the acronym FEAR, False Evidence Appearing Real, or FEAR. In moments of paranoia or heightened anxiety, I noticed that many of the patterns or connections that I was making were driven by fear. By consciously associating fear-driven connections with being false, I was able to organize and filter my thoughts more effectively. When you experience fear, it can act as a signal that the pattern you're recognizing may be based on distorted thinking. By using fear as a mental model, you can check whether a pattern aligns with reality or if it's emotionally driven by fear, paranoia, or anxiety. This emotional alignment can act as a guidepost. If it's off-kilter and invokes fear, you can feel safe to discard it as noise, just as you would with an audio track. This framework could act as a form of mental self-engineering, where you refine your ability to distinguish between metaphorical or literal interpretations of the patterns you see. You can think of it as a grounding technique, where you filter out cognitive noise and focus on genuine insight, allowing you to retain your creative and intuitive capabilities while staying mentally balanced. By using cognitive tools like the FEAR acronym and reframing experiences as metaphorical or poetic truths, individuals can navigate heightened states with more control and clarity. These strategies serve as a cognitive noise reduction, helping filter out delusions and distortions while preserving useful creative insights. This is not about dismissing the patterns people see, but rather helping them frame these patterns in a way that enriches their experience without leading to harmful or isolating beliefs. In doing so, we can provide a framework for both grounding and growth. So I hope this video can serve as an effective cognitive primer, helping you see the image I've been trying to paint. Then again, maybe it's all just noise.